Good morning to everybody. My name is Nuno Silva. I'm the head of External Statistics and Sector Accounts in the Directorate General Statistics of the European Central Bank. And today I'm here to talk about international cooperation for climate-related data. In particular, I want to give you an overview of the G20 Data Gaps Initiative as regards climate-related recommendations, which means recommendations 1 to 7. So what is the outline for the presentation today? So we will start by talking about international cooperation for climate data, so why we need it and how we do it. Then we will go through the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, in particular the third initiative, so DGI3. We will elaborate more in detail the 7 climate-related recommendations that we have. We will then focus on one of them, recommendation 4 on climate finance, and then we will briefly conclude. So why does international cooperation then matters? So financial risk and climate impact, they have no borders. And we currently have rather fragmented data, which undermines the policy coherence of market and market transparency. So we need to design coherent policies, and so we need a data set that is pretty harmonized and available worldwide. So international cooperation can deliver that. So we can, through international cooperation, not only develop data comparability by defining international statistical standards that can be applied by everybody, but we can also work together to define data availability or to improve data availability. And certainly international organizations and forums like the United Nations, the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, as you hear in the next slides, the IMF, the Financial Stability Board and BIS, but also the European institutions like ECB or Eurostat can play an important role in making this data available. So it is extremely important international cooperation because we need to have data that allow us to have evidence-based policy making. And so we cannot do policies out of thin air. So risk assessments across jurisdiction is a global reality, and we need to have a global perspective and global data availability to design these policies. So we need altogether to define coordinated policy solutions because the threats are global, and so we need to be able to cooperate and coordinate between us. And we need, in particular, as you will see, to have a consistent tracking of sustainable finance, because we need to finance the transition, and so we need to trace what is the financial resources that are available for this transition. So let's get a bit more on the specificities of international cooperation. I think we all have experienced already how difficult it is at national level to reach a consensus and to try to find an harmonized way of seeing the same reality. Obviously, this is particularly difficult when you move from the national domestic concept into regional or even international agreements. And so international cooperation, it's particularly different when countries are coming from slightly different realities. So what we try to do is that we building on self-commitments and the willingness of countries to voluntarily cooperate. So we have to find approaches that are able to fit different realities, and we all know around the world we all face slightly different realities, and so cooperation needs to account for this aspect. But we have to make sure that there is a minimum level of ambition so that the outcome we have from this international cooperation is actually meaningful. So we try to do this by bridging on formal and informal collaboration frameworks. On one side, we have international organizations like the IMF, the United Nations or the World Bank that support these cooperation initiatives, but we need to rely also on more informal platforms like the G20 or the Financial Stability Board in order to get cooperation moving and ensuring that altogether we develop the necessary frameworks for measurement, in particular of the climate impact. So let me now talk about the G20 Data Gaps Initiative. The G20 led an initiative that started in 2009 with the objective of closing policy relevant data gaps that were identified following the global financial crisis. So this was DGI 1. Meanwhile, there was DGI 2 in the middle of last decade, and we have now DGI 3, which has 14 recommendations. This last DGI, the ongoing DGI, has 4 topics or 4 areas. The first one is climate change, which is certainly the most important, as DGI 3 was around, I would say, mostly climate aspects, but it also has household distributional information as one of the core topics, as fintech and financial inclusion, and access to private and administrative data and data sharing. As you can imagine, the last one is particularly important and is a bit cross-cutting because it allows actually to develop all the other data sets. So data availability and access to data is very important for statisticians. I think the 7 recommendations that I will present to you related to climate highlight very well the urgency and the cross-cutting nature of these climate topics. So, what are then the 7 climate-related recommendations we have in DGI 3? The first recommendation is around greenhouse gas emission accounts and national carbon footprints, and the plan is to develop indicators that allow all the economies and economists around the world to monitor whether the national targets that have been defined by the countries in terms of emissions are being accomplished. The second recommendation is around energy accounts. So it recognizes that the energy industry or sector is particularly important as regards climate, and so we are developing special accounts for the energy sector in order to monitor whether the energy mix is going in the right direction in terms of climate targets. The third recommendation is related with the carbon footprint of foreign direct investment, which means in practice that we would like to have indicators that gives us an idea of what are the emissions of purely domestic companies vis-a-vis those that are controlled by foreigners or multinationals. Recommendation 4, I will be elaborating a bit more in the next few slides. Then on recommendation 5, we have forward-looking risk indicators, which look in particular into the impact of the current physical risks on the economy and try to measure what is the potential impact of these risks. Recommendation 6 is around government, and we try to see what is the role that subsidies play in minimizing the climate impact and financing the transition. Recommendation 7 is on mitigation and adaptation expenditure. So we try to measure what are the expenses that are being taken by the countries in order to address mitigation and adaptation costs, so that we are sure that the targets that have been defined for emissions are being accomplished and the expenses are appropriate. Let's focus now on recommendation 4 on climate finance and try to understand what is behind this recommendation. So the policy driver of recommendation 4 is the consideration that we need to support the transition to a more resilient economy, and policymakers require data that allows them to track the funding of these projects to sponsor climate transition. So currently, there is clearly a lack of reliable and comparable indicators for tracking climate finance via debt securities and equity instruments across the G20 economies. So what recommendation 4 then aims is at addressing this data gap by developing 2 things. One is a set of reporting templates that basically guides the countries on what they should make available. And the second one is a set of methodological guidance notes that provides them support on how to put together these climate finance indicators. The target is to have statistics on climate finance for debt securities and green listed shares by sector of the issuer and of the holder, and with some additional breakdowns, for example, by maturity or type of interest rate. As you can see, the target is not yet on green loans because the definition of methodological guidance for these instruments is still even at an earlier stage. So we have a task team which is responsible for the development of these templates and methodological guidance, and the task team members are coming from all the G20 and FSP economies except currently Australia and Hong Kong. As I was also saying, this work is led by the BIS and ECB in particular. We have also the support of the IMF, of the FSP and the OECD, and we are organizing ourselves around the working group on securities database, which has also sponsored other Data Gaps Initiative 1 and 2. So what has been the progress on the implementation of Recommendation 4? The work started in 2023 and so far has been focusing on setting up the infrastructure for the implementation. So until, I would say, mid-24, we have developed the reporting templates where you have a link in the presentation, and these templates are available already on the internet, which provides, I would say, a good indication of what we expect to become available in the near future. We have also developed methodological guidance and definitions on climate finance for debt securities and green listed shares. We hope that there is clear guidance so that countries can produce statistics that are actually comparable on the basis of this harmonized methodology. Now, since the middle of 24 until currently mid-25, we have asked the G20 and the FSP economies to provide their self-commitments. So out of these templates, on the basis of the methodology that we have defined, we have asked them to precisely highlight what they will be making available. The plan is that by the end of 25, data on green debt securities should be made available, and then 2 years later, data on green listed shares should be made available. What we have seen, as you will see in the next slide, is that self-commitments are now covering more than 20,000 new time series that should become available. So what are then the next steps for Recommendation 4 work? So the results of a stock taking that was taken by this task team see that Recommendation 4 implementation work is pretty much on track. So all economies plan to report data on issuances of climate finance debt securities by the expected deadline, which is the end of 25. And that we hope that significant new data will become available soon. I mean, in the case of the euro area, we have already published some indicators, and we expect to enhance these indicators, I would say, in the next year. There is also, most economies have plans for reporting data on holdings of climate finance debt securities by the end of 26. And also with others complementing these holdings data by the end of 27. And this end of 27 is also the date for the ending of the Recommendation 4 work, and we expect that all economies with self-commitments for green listed shares will also be making data available. So what is coming up in terms of Recommendation 4, so we will have some additional workshops in the context of the task team. We need to support countries in the implementation of the recommendation. We need to share experiences and best practices so that we make sure that at the end of 27 we have all countries with their self-commitments accomplished, and that we have more data available globally. As a way of conclusion, I think DGI3 climate recommendations are building a global foundation for climate statistics. Recommendation 4 in particular on climate finance, we believe is central to track climate finance flows and to make sure that we have the necessary resources to address climate change. We will continue cooperating worldwide, not only technically but also politically, to ensure that there is momentum for the development of these statistics so that we can actually achieve our targets that have been defined for the end of 25 and the end of 27. And within the ECB, we are leading by example. So we have built a coherent and transparent climate data ecosystem by releasing not only sustainable finance, greenhouse gas emissions, and physical risk indicators. Thank you for your attention.